I think the first thing is kind of an idea for a segment that I want to start doing more regularly, which is recent readings. Some of the stuff that I have been reading lately and are currently reading, and some of the takeaways, the highlights, the annotations I've made from those texts. I think the biggest one right now that I'm reading, I tend to read things on and off. I don't always read things continuously. I might start something and not finish it for a while. For example, I started Beyond Nature and Culture, and I haven't finished it yet. I got about 14% of the way. And I could say 14% because I have it on my Kobo, which, it's an e-reader that I got recently. So I started that, didn't finish it. Making my way through how Europe underdeveloped Africa right now. And that's my main read at the moment. It has been a long time coming. I had read reviews about it before. I had gotten the gist, as you might say, but I really wanted to take my time and go through the text. And oh my God, is it so worth it? Like every author, he has his biases. Walter Rodney, that is. Walter Rodney, by the way, is a Guyanese Marxist, and he had a lot to say about the world and about particularly the political situation, the economic situation in Africa. And, he's coming from a Marxist perspective, he's coming from a historian's perspective, and he is approaching the subject with, I think, a lot of grace and a lot of balance. He's not taking this kind of pseudo African nationalist perspective where it tries to paint an inaccurate picture or a rosy picture of the situation in Africa. And he doesn't paint this sort of white, bourgeois, Western kind of perspective on Africa that dismisses it as irrelevant or as not worthy of consideration in the discussion and exploration of history. Going into it, I was expecting to see a basic overview of the specific incidents that took place in Africa's history where Europe underdeveloped it, as the title might imply. I got so much more. First of all, the book goes into defining development. It goes into the history of Africa prior to colonization, how Africa contributed to European capitalism. And right now I'm in chapter 4, Europe and the Roots of African Underdevelopment. Haven't finished that chapter yet. It's flying by though. I had the intention of finishing the book this week, but certain things got into the way, so I didn't get to finish it quite yet. But I want to share some of the highlights that I got from the book, and I hope just hearing those highlights are an encouragement for you to check out the book as well. One of the highlights I saw was, quote, "When the experts from capitalist countries do not give a racist explanation, they nevertheless confuse the issue by giving as causes of underdevelopment the things which really are consequences." Here's another one. Today, in many African countries, the foreign ownership is still present, although the armies and flags of foreign powers have been removed. So long as foreigners own land, mines, factories, banks, insurance companies, means of transportation, newspapers, power stations, then for so long will the wealth of Africa flow outwards into the hands of those elements. In other words, in the absence of direct political control, foreign investment ensures that the natural resources and the labor of Africa produce economic value which is lost to the continent. Here's another one for you. The question as to who and what is responsible for African underdevelopment can be answered at two levels. First, the answer is that the operation of the imperialist system bears major responsibility for African economic retardation by draining African wealth and by making it impossible to develop more rapidly the resources of the continent. Second, one has to deal with those who manipulate the system, and those are either agents or unwitting accomplices of the said system. The capitalists of Western Europe were the ones who actively extended the exploitation from inside Europe to cover the whole of Africa. In recent times, they were joined and to some extent replaced by capitalists from the United States. And for many years now, even the workers of those metropolitan countries have benefited from the exploitation and underdevelopment of Africa. None of these remarks are intended to remove the ultimate responsibility for development from the shoulders of Africans. Not only are there African accomplices inside the imperialist system, but every African has a responsibility to understand the system and work for its overthrow. Now, I think one of the challenges I've been having with the text is, well, he does take that kind of classic Marxist, stagist approach to history, where, there's this kind of inevitable progression of development that isn't really challenged. And I think there's also an issue I've been having, which is the question of development to what end. I'm not saying that he doesn't address that. He knows what end that he is going for, which is, in his stagist perception, capitalism to socialism to communism, right? Feudalism to capitalism to socialism to colonialism, rather. And he's talking about, for much of the book, how the colonization of Africa, and prior to colonization of Africa, the enslavement of Africa basically impeded Africa's progression into those next stages, particularly in the parts of the continent where feudalism had developed, or something akin to feudalism had developed. His argument is that the establishment of, later stages was basically blocked because of this intervention by Europe and by the European economy. I think for me, considering especially what we know now about the climate crisis, about climate change, about how this kind of development of resources turns out, I mean, he's writing in his time, right? I can't remember when the book was written. I think it was in the 70s or 80s that he wrote this. I understand at that time, the question of development was really at the forefront. And I'm not saying the development is not still necessary. Basic things like sanitation, like access to plumbing, food, water. That stuff is vital. That stuff is critical. But at the same time, we speak so much about the wealth of Africa and of its resources, about its human resources and its mineral resources and all these different things. But is our aim to simply industrialize to the same extent that Africa and the world as a whole becomes unlivable? This is something I've been grappling with even before I started reading this book, which is how do we, those of us in the quote-unquote developing world, chart a path for ourselves that doesn't lead to the exact same destructive infrastructure and destructive social relations, How do we get some of the benefits without some of the drawbacks? Now, there are certain things that we can point to and say we will benefit from. We can look at the mistakes and say, okay, so we can avoid those mistakes, right? It's like kind of like how the UK was one of the first countries to establish railways all around the country. But now they're fallen behind in the railway department, in the train department, because to upgrade their tracks will cost a lot more than the cost of simply laying down completely new tracks, as countries that never developed significant railway infrastructure are now able to do. Right? Like China's throwing down all this rapid rail because prior to rapid rail, they didn't have rail. You get what I'm saying? So there are certain things that we can avoid, certain steps. I would love to see developing countries, for example, avoid this whole unnecessary step of America sneeze and we catch a cold, and so we must have car-centric infrastructure too. We don't need to develop in that direction. Development is not skyscrapers and highways, or it shouldn't be. I think there's a way to utilize resources that doesn't get caught up in those very shortcomings that Europe and America, more so America, are dealing with now. Another highlight for me, he put into words something that I literally said before I read the book. I made a tweet a long time ago where I said something along the lines of, I'm sick and tired of Eurocentric Afrocentrism, which is an approach to Africa and African history and African development that fixates on how it measures up to Europe, how what Europe has done can be found in Africa, whether it be castles, whether it be monarchy, whether it be empires. Those are the things that people look for in Africa, and I welcome it. I want to see the good, the bad, and the ugly. I wish people did not approach Africa simply to try and prove a point. He makes a similar point here in the book. He says, quote, "The moment that the topic of the pre-European African past is raised, many individuals are concerned for various reasons to know about the existence of African civilizations. Mainly, this stems from a desire to make comparisons with European civilizations. This is not the context in which to evaluate the so-called civilizations of Europe. It is enough to note the behavior of European capitalists from the epoch of slavery through colonialism, fascism, and genocidal wars in Asia and Africa. Such barbarism causes suspicion to attach to the use of the word civilization to describe Western Europe and North America. As far as Africa is concerned during the period of early development, it is preferable to speak in terms of cultures rather than civilization." Afrobaka, somebody actually asked me what my take was on Afro-pessimism in the last stream. I haven't looked into it enough to have settled thoughts on it. So not for now. No, I don't have a take on it quite yet. I don't want to look into it further. This is a fun fact that I learned in the book. Quote, "Through North Africa, Europeans became familiar with a superior brand of red leather from Africa, which was termed Moroccan leather. In fact, it was tanned and dyed by Hausa and Mandinga specialists in northern Nigeria and Mali. It reminded me of how Arabic numerals were called Arabic numerals in Europe, despite the fact that they originated in India, simply because of where Europeans found out about the thing. In this case, they found the leather through Morocco, so they called it Moroccan leather. In numerals case, they found it through the Arabs, so they called it Arabic numerals." He makes a statement that I disagreed with, which is that the state arose as an instrument to be used by a particular class to control the rest of society in its own interests. This gets into, I think, one of my major rifts with the Marxists, particularly the Marxist Leninists, which is this idea that the state is this neutral instrument and that any class can wield it to pursue their own interests. I think the idea that the exploited class can take control of the state and suddenly not take on a new class position due to that new position in society is very odd to me. The idea of this proletarian state, even though proletarian describes a condition under capitalism wherein you have nothing to sell but your labor, it's weird to me that like these proletarians would maintain that proletarian, I don't know, essence, spirit, soul, or whatever, even while they are in a completely different position in the pecking order of society. But if you want to think and dwell more on that, you could just look at any anarchist critique of the state, particularly the ones addressed toward fellow socialists. Right? There's actually one by, I think his name is Hector Morel, a dialogue between, actually let me pull that up. Dialogue between an anarchist and authoritarian. This is a pretty good read. It gets into some of the disagreements between the anarchists and the socialists as far back as 1888. So yeah, back to how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Obviously, if Europe could tell Africans what to export, that would be an expression of European power. However, it would be a mistake to believe there was an overwhelmingly military power. Europeans found it impossible to conquer Africans during the early centuries of trade, except in isolated spots on the coast. European power resided in their system of production, which was at a somewhat higher level than Africa's at the time. European society was leaving feudalism and was moving towards capitalism. African society was then entering a phase comparable to feudalism. I'm sure if you read UNESCO's General History of Africa, I heard new volumes just came out. I haven't read it yet. I read UNESCO's History of the Caribbean, not all of the volumes, but one or two of them. And it was an invaluable resource when I was doing research on a book that I was writing that I put on the back burner. I haven't finished that book yet. I've kind of suspended working on it for some time. UNESCO tends to bring together some really, well-read and well-cited authors to deliver those kind of historical chapters. And so I'm sure that the UNESCO History of Africa is just as fantastic. Another thing he points out was the ways that European nations in challenging, in kind of creating the demand for conflict in Africa through the slave trade, they were able to benefit from whichever nation won a conflict because they got the captives either way. Quote, any European trader could arrive on the coast of West Africa and exploit the political differences which he found there. For example, in the small territory that the Portuguese later claimed as Guinea-Bissau, there were more than a dozen ethnic groups. But listen to this part, right? In the simplest of societies where there were no kings, it proved impossible for Europeans to strike up the alliance which was necessary to carry on a trade in captives on the coast. In those societies with the ruling groups, the association with Europeans was easily established, and afterwards Europe hardened the existing internal class divisions and created new ones. So in essence, the non-centralized, or less hierarchical societies were more resilient to that kind of engagement with Europe, which would have led it to war captives and enslavements, that kind of thing. Versus the hierarchical societies managed to basically connect with fellow dominators in the Europeans, and both were able to derive profit from dominating others. Now, obviously, the Europeans profited a lot more than those African dominators did. Speaking of which, I really chafe at this use of the term African ahistorically, especially when it comes to this narrative that you see all the time by people who have not read a lick of African history but learned this one factoid from somewhere. This notion that Africans sold Africans. It's ridiculous. It's an absurd notion. Africans did not sell Africans because African as an identity, as a category, was not something that was consciously upheld or thought to exist at that point in time. You might as well describe World War II as Europeans killing Europeans. That makes no sense. World War II was a diverse and layered conflict involving several political entities and actors and cultures that would never be simplified in such a way, and yet for some reason, out of laziness, out of a desire to skirt responsibility, there's this claim that, Africans sold Africans. No. Different groups on the continent sold other groups on the continent. And some of those groups that were the sellers soon became the sold at other points in history, right? But at no point did any of those actors consider themselves African. Let me see what other highlights I want to bring out here. A single African state at the time could not emancipate itself from European control. The small size of African states and the numerous political divisions made it so much easier for Europe to make the decisions as to Africa's role in world production and trade. Here's a quote that basically got to the point I was getting at. Many guilty consciences jobs have been created by the slave trade. Europeans know that they carried on the slave trade, and Africans are aware that the trade would have been impossible if certain Africans did not cooperate with the slave ships. To ease their guilty consciences, Europeans try to throw the major responsibility for the slave trade on the Africans, right? When we're talking about where the demand was coming from, it's very clear who was manufacturing that demand, who was dictating that demand, who was encouraging that flow. And there were even cases where slaver societies tried to put a stop to the practice, and, well, you can imagine they were shut down pretty quickly. Issues that I hadn't even recognized before, but it really makes sense when you think about it. We tend to call the slave trade that took place between Africa, the Americas, and Europe as the transatlantic slave trade. And yet, when we speak of the trans-Saharan slave trade or the East African slave trade, you're much more likely to hear the term Arab slave trade, because Arabic people were the ones doing the trading. Quote, this is in a section titled the European slave trade as a basic factor in African underdevelopment. The European slave trade as a basic factor in African underdevelopment. He says, quote, the title of this section is deliberately chosen to call attention to the fact that the shipments were all by Europeans to markets controlled by Europeans, and this was in the interest of European capitalism and nothing else. In East Africa and the Sudan, many Africans were taken by Arabs and were sold to Arab buyers. This is known in European books as the Arab slave trade. Therefore, let it be clear that when Europeans shipped Africans to European buyers, it was the European slave trade from Africa. This is more of a gotcha, but I think it's a valuable illustration of how we term things highlights the biases of the society applying that terminology. He pointed out this shocking statistic about the estimated world population in millions according to the continents, and he highlighted how from 1650 to 1900, Africa's population only went from 100 to 120 million. Obviously, I haven't looked into these numbers since, so it's possible these are not considered inaccurate figures, but I thought it was worth looking at anyway. In Europe, from 1650, the number was 103 million. And by 1900, it had jumped to 423 million. In Asia, the number was 257 million in 1650, and by 1900, it had jumped to 857 million. The point of the figures is really to highlight the population loss that was inflicted by the process of enslavement and colonization. Not just those who were lost through the Middle Passage, but also those who would have been born if not for the ravages of the trade. And so that's as much as I want to get into so far. I have a lot more highlights from the book, but I hope this is like an encouragement to check it out if you haven't already. If it's on your to-read list and you haven't gotten to it yet, give it a look. Give it a look. There's another book that I intend to pick up once I finish this one, because I try not to start too many books at once, and that is Necropolitics. I've received that recommendation quite a few times to check that out. I want to check out Necropolitics. That is by Achille Mbembe. And so when I read that, I'll probably share my highlights and thoughts on that one as well. I also intend to read this, which is The Enduring Relevance of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Karim F. Hirji, once I'm finished with the book, because it engages with a lot of the criticisms that Rodney's book got after he published it, where it still holds up to this day, that kind of thing. So yeah, I hope you'll check out, and because I always like to as well engage with critiques of books after I've read them, because, you know, books can be very compelling, especially when they're very well written. And I don't want to get so caught up in, wow, that was such an amazing book, that I don't engage with the critiques and try and balance it out. Because if an author has all the attention for all the hours that you spend reading it, it could create a kind of a tunnel vision if you're not careful. So I wanted to also seek out critiques, follow-ups, responses, epilogues, all those different kind of things to the books I read, including this one. This is not the only one that I might look into, but I saw this one and it looked particularly compelling, so I'll give it a read next. Happy Black History Month.